Welcome back to the Blackletter Podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to another episode of the Blackletter Podcast. I have Sharon, Heaton, and Wright Lewis back with me. Last time we talked about how to prep your business for sale, what it means to go to market, making yourself as a business owner redundant and not the center of the business, because that makes the business less valuable. And we talked about change of control agreements and tricks with those, whole bunch of stuff. We're going to talk about the 3 stages of the M&A process. Now, you've prepared your business for sale, and you're going to Sharon to help you go through the M&A process. You're going to Wright to do a letter of intent or an asset purchase agreement or an equity purchase agreement. We'll talk about that a little bit as well, probably. So Sharon, what are the 3 stages of selling a business? And by the way, folks, if you didn't hear on the last episode, we've got slides. They're up on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. But Sharon can talk through all of this. But if you want to see the pretty pictures, we'll also provide a link to those slides at the bottom of this audio episode so you can go back through them as well. Go ahead, Sharon. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, there are 3 stages to selling a company. Now, this presumes that some thought and preparation has been done prior to going to market. Okay, so we talked about that in the last episode, the importance of doing that. Sometimes people do it, sometimes they don't. It kind of just varies. So there are 3 phases, and we'll go into them in greater detail. The first is preparation, and preparation is an internal process. It's what the company needs to do with its outside advisors to make sure that it really has looked deeply at the company. We'll go back and discuss that. Buyer qualification. This is where I refer to as the dating phase. It's when the seller is going out looking for a buyer. And this is the one that has the least control because you might find the absolute perfect buyer on your first date, but it may actually take you a couple of kissing of frogs to get to the right one. So that's phase 2. Phase 3 starts at the signing of a letter of intent. You have a buyer, you have the commercial terms, and you've got to get from that LOI to closing. This is the area where Wright becomes the Superman and gets it closed in that phase 3. So let's talk about these 3 phases. The first is preparation. And in saying this, I want to make it really clear. M&A is a team sport. Wright and I have worked together before, and as a result, we kind of know what to do with each other. But there's also accountants involved and personal financial planners, and there might be some HR issues, etc. So understand who your team is going to be. Your team needs to have at least an M&A advisor and an M&A attorney. And I'm going to get a little on a soapbox here again. Please make sure that you're working with an M&A attorney. Not all attorneys know M&A. If you had a heart problem, you wouldn't go to a dermatologist. If you're going to sell your company, your corporate lawyer may be terrific, but unless they do M&A, go find an M&A attorney. You don't want somebody learning Sharon, on your dime.
If I had a lawyer that I knew that it was my brother-in-law who does DUIs, I probably shouldn't have him review an M&A LOI for me and give me legal advice.
That is exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
The guy
and that
did
happens,
your trust
right?
and estate. This guy did my trust and estate. He was fantastic. I love him. He sold my house. You know, it was a complicated transaction. Selling a house and selling a company, pretty much the same thing, right? No, not right. So your nephew who's just graduated law school, run for the hills. You want to be doing working with somebody who's done this 500 times before, not 5.
I will just testify to having been on calls where Wright is working with my clients on an M&A deal and talking about the bucket and the revenue requirements and what's traditional and standard in these deals. And if you don't know that stuff, I've been an IP lawyer for over 20 years. I'm a professor. I teach it. And I wouldn't do an M&A deal without bringing in Wright or somebody who knows this stuff. So I'm just testifying on your behalf, agreeing with you. Like, it is insanely different than other areas of law. Just like I don't think Wright would probably want to do a patent litigation case.
100%, and you two are too kind. But I can echo the sentiment from Sharon that even if it's the other party, people often will ask me how much it's going to cost for me to represent them as a seller or as a buyer or whoever. And a lot of times, Sharon's favorite answer, it depends, and it depends on a lot of factors that are outside our control. It depends on who they hire to represent who is the buyer's attorney or who is the seller's attorney. If the seller hired their cousin that does estate planning, it could be very much more expensive because we have to now negotiate over things that two M&A lawyers wouldn't necessarily have to negotiate over or explain. And sometimes it's even, frankly, I've seen it where an unrepresented, buyer or seller is better than an underrepresented buyer or seller because, they don't think they know anything, right? And, they don't have to defend themselves and justify their existence. So, truly, it's in the best interest of everyone to hire somebody who has been there and done it before, hopefully numerous times recently. And, it's cheaper for everyone involved to get the right people involved. And frankly, a deal that doesn't get done because somebody didn't have a good or experienced counsel is a real possibility in those situations.
So let me ask this. So now we have the team. We know we need the team. Let's talk about what the business has to do. Let's talk about what the preparation stages. We talked about the preparation of getting the team together and getting yourself redundant, but what actually physical stuff, data rooms, documents, what do I have to give you if I'm a business in order for you to give to the purchaser of the business if I'm selling my business? What is that?
First thing that's going to happen is that you're going to have an M&A advisor, hopefully, who is going to do due diligence on your company because buyers are going to come in and they're looking for problems. They are eager to buy a company, but they're also very, very nervous and they're looking for problems. And every company I've ever looked at, every company has strengths, but has challenges as well. And it's really important that we identify what those challenges are and either fix them if we can, or own them if we cannot, and understand why the company is doing it that way. So I had one company that was seeing their net working capital increase by a tremendous amount over a period of a year or two. Got to the point where the net working capital was in the $5, $6, $7, $8 million range. And I was trying to figure out why this makes no sense. That's crazy. It turned out that this client was getting paid from its customers on a 90-day basis, but was using vendors and was paying them on a 30-day basis. So I said, what are you doing? You're basically making a loan to these vendors. Wow. Why don't you pay them when you get paid? And they said, Sharon, you don't understand. Our vendors are two guys in a truck. They need to get paid in order to make their mortgage payment, to make their car payment, to whatever. When we pay them within 15 to 30 days, they are so loyal to us, they will drop any other job to come work for us. We know we're going to get paid by our Fortune 100 clients, so we can wait and we can just hold that. But as a result, we have a group of loyal vendors that will, walk through fire for us. I said, great. You've just taken something that I, as a third party, identified as a problem, turned it into an asset. We were able to explain it that way, and it never became a problem when we sold that company. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for in phase one. We're looking for, what are the strengths of your company? What are the challenges? Are those challenges real challenges, or are they strengths? And what are we going to talk about? We want to make sure that by the time we're talking to folks in phase two, we know what those weaknesses are and can talk about them without, having to justify anything. Right? What's been your experience?
Understanding the cash flow cycle of your business and making sure you understand what that is and how that affects the valuation of your company, and also what your net working capital target is going to be. I don't want to, we'll probably get into net working capital at some time. Maybe now is the right time. I don't know. But, net working capital is a conversation that it seems like no matter how many times, working with you all or on my, on my own, no matter how many times I have it with my client who's a seller, By the time we get to the point where they see what the target is, it's a surprise, and it feels like they're getting a price reduction in most scenarios. So, understanding, what makes your business run, and that, the transaction structure, most of these transactions are cash free and debt free. So, what are your payoffs, and then what do you need to leave in the business, and what are you actually going to walk away with? Is actually a mathematical equation that sometimes we don't find out until very close to closing, and so that can be a long pole in the tent, as you well know.
Right. That's an incredibly important point. Again, as an M&A advisor, most of our compensation comes upon the successful closing of a deal. Not all of it, but most of it. So one of the really important things to do in this phase one preparation is to come to an understanding with our seller. What do we think this company is going to sell for? If we look at it and we say, we think this company is going to sell for 18 to 20, and you think, nah, I really want 22, probably going to bridge that gap. It's going to be okay. But if we say 18 to 20 million, and you think you wouldn't sell it for less than 30 or 35, then we need to stop and really think about it. Because if we can't get you the price that you think, then we shouldn't be working on it. You deserve somebody who believes in that valuation. Now, we want to get you the most amount of money that you can. We're totally on board for that. But we also know that there's a market. And, we were working on one deal where we thought that the price was going to be about $18 million. We've now gotten about 11 different LOIs, and they're all in the 16 to 17 million. We thought it was going to be 18. So we were wrong, but that's what the market is saying, but it's close enough that the client's going to be fine. If the client was saying, I wouldn't consider selling for less than 20, less than 30, and we thought it was 18, it's not going to work. So phase one is really where we're putting all the documents together. We're looking at the financials. We're looking for the flaws. We're trying to figure out what the story of the company is going to be. It's not simply a bunch of spreadsheets that get thrown out. How did the company get created? How did it grow? Why did it grow? What's going on here? So that's phase one. Phase one is kind of internal facing.
So you've got the company prepared on your end. You've got a potential list of buyers on your end. How do you find and sell the company to buyers? How do you get buyers? I mean, that's kind of opaque to almost everyone. That's such a strange, who's buying companies?
There's lots of different categories of buyers, and not all categories of buyers are interested in all categories of sellers. So you kind of have to look at who the company is and, who the likely buyer for that's going to be. But, let's say that we have a 3-part process for finding buyers. The first is we're in the market all the time. So people come to us and say, I'm interested in buying a company. Now, if they're interested in buying a services company and we have a manufacturing company, we're not going to talk to them about that. But if we have a services company, we will. So we have our own lists of potential buyers. Second is we have a list of what we refer to as centers of influence: lawyers, accountants, commercial bankers, other investment bankers, insurance agents, a whole bunch of people, because they know which of their clients are thinking about doing an acquisition. So we'll reach out to those people. And then, of course, we've made up a list of people who are either in the same industry or closely adjacent. Now, those people you can be careful with, because on one hand, selling to a strategic is fantastic. You can sometimes get a better valuation. Sometimes, you have somebody who knows about your company more. They understand the industry. You don't have to explain all sorts of things. So all of that's great. The downside is that this is somebody who's likely to be a competitor of yours, either an actual or a potential competitor. So you're about to disclose everything about your company, all of your pricing, all of your customers, everything that you've got to somebody who may not close that deal. So it's pretty important that the seller be involved in looking at the list of buyers to make sure that there's not somebody there who would be a problem for them.
Talk about what due diligence is a little bit and how the LOI process works.
I think that there's 3 levels of due diligence. The first level happens in phase 1, where essentially you're doing due diligence on yourself. When somebody looks at me, what are they going to see? I had somebody send me something recently. They sent me their financials and they said they had 14% margins. I looked at it and said, you've got 8% margins. And they said, oh, yeah. we're wrong. We have to adjust these things. And by the way, only look at the last 2 months. It's like, okay, that's why we do this preparation stuff. So there's a lot of due diligence in phase one because we want to find what the problems are. Phase two, there's two sets of due diligence going on. There's, of course, the buyer doing due diligence on the seller, but the seller should do some due diligence on the buyer. Is this a credible buyer? Can they come up with the money? Are they what we refer to as a tire kicker? Or are they somebody who really wants to do a deal? And we do due diligence on the buyer, but more importantly, we make the buyer do a lot of due diligence on the seller in phase two. We want to make sure that that buyer understands the essential strengths and challenges of that company when it comes time to that LOI. We don't want that LOI being only rainbows and unicorns. We want to make sure that the problems are there. Phase three has even deeper due diligence. It's sometimes referred to as confirmatory, but that's when you get into employment plans and to insurance policies and all sorts of legal analysis. Right? Where have you been on due diligence?
Well, let me just highlight something here that what Sharon just said is part of the huge value unlock that hiring an M&A advisor is. I mean, when you have somebody like SB Liftoff who's going to do all of that ahead of time, the chances of you making a sale and maximizing the value are much, much higher. I mean, I also deal with, SMB transactions as well. And it is a completely different situation. There are lots of surprises for buyers, at various later stages in the process. Sellers, sometimes will play hide the ball, right? So whether you're a buyer or a seller, there's a lot of value in having the seller represented by somebody like Sharon. And then, as an attorney, it's also super helpful for us. They've already identified a lot of the challenges. Maybe they've asked us to help, remediate some of those challenges ahead of time and got us involved early so that we're not scrambling to fix problems at the last second. And just, it just makes the whole process a lot more pleasant and better for everyone involved, including the sellers who are, like I said before, this whole process is another job for them. And the more involved they already are in their existing business, the more overwhelmed they're going to be during due diligence.
Okay, so let's talk about now LOI to closing. So the confirmatory due diligence you just talked about. What happens? And I know Sharon's involved in this, but right, when I've seen you work these cases, this becomes a big part of what you do, and that's the asset purchase or equity purchase agreement. And how does that happen? And generally, how is the seller involved in this closing process?
Once the seller has an LOI that they like, or maybe even a couple LOIs, but certainly one that they are considering really moving forward with, that's usually where we get brought into the process. And at the LOI stage, and I don't know if we've defined this, but it's letter of intent. There are other acronyms out there that people use in various different levels of the market, but it's essentially the same thing. It's a generally non-binding agreement that outlines the material terms of the transaction. It kind of sets the framework for what the purchase agreement is going to look like. The buyer is.
Let me ask you a question on that, though. Right?
Yeah.
So we see non-binding. Generally, these have a no shop provision. Is that right?
Right. So the majority of the clauses will be non-binding, but there will be, the non-disclosure and the no shop provisions. Those will be binding on the respective parties. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because I do know that the one thing that happens with an LOI, it's non-binding, but you can't disclose stuff, and you as a company can't go out to other buyers if a buyer is going to spend time on diligence with you. Right.
That's right.
So,
the buyer is going to expect that you agree to be exclusive with them, usually for a period of 60 to 90 days, sometimes 120 days, depending on how hairy they think diligence is going to be and the level of lift that the transaction is going to be. And that's actually what I was about to, kind of get into, which is that the buyer is generally going to want to keep things as general as possible in the LOI, kind of looser.
Right.
And the seller will want to negotiate as many details as possible because they lose a lot of negotiating power once they're under exclusivity in the LOI. And they're going to be they're going to have to deal with diligence. Yeah, some of the, I mean, just real quick, I mean, some of the top topics that, both sides, I mean, both sides do want the key terms in the LOI, right? So even though the buyer wants to keep things more general and the seller would like to have more detail, you do still want to have all the key terms that are important, that are very important to both parties in the LOI, because otherwise you're just, wasting your time on maybe negotiating a transaction that neither party is going to agree to. So, but the key terms that we always see is some sort of introduction or pitch from the buyer as to why they're the best, and how they're going to take care of the seller's business and their employees and their legacy and things like that. And it's very important to sellers to see that. Price is obviously huge. The terms of the purchase, so things like how much cash at closing, whether there's a seller note or any kind of contingent payments. And then the structure of the transaction is always involved as well, whether we're going to be doing a purchase of stock, asset purchase, or a merger. And most transactions in lower middle market outside of GovCon companies are going to be asset purchases, unless there's some form of private equity involvement and they're requiring equity rollover or something like that. So there are special circumstances where stock purchases come into play. Most are going to be asset purchases, but for government contracts specifically, and a lot of the deals that I've worked on with Sharon, the federal government, these contracts are non-assignable. And so you have to go through a process called novation. So essentially, the lesser evil is to go ahead and do a stock purchase for the buyer and just do a lot more, deep diligence and make sure that you really know what you're buying.
Yeah. So guys, I'm going to, our turkey timer has popped and our turkey is cooked for this episode. I think we've covered the process pretty well. What are we going to talk about in the next episode so we can leave our listeners with a cliffhanger?
Valuation. How do companies get valued?
Everybody wants to know what their company's worth, and they all have an idea. They're like, oh, I'm 3x revenue, which, okay, maybe you are. So we'll talk about valuation in the next episode. Tune in for that, because we're going to go deep into valuation with two experts here who've dealt with valuation of hundreds, possibly thousands of companies. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Blackletter Podcast. Download us wherever you get your podcast. Watch us on YouTube if you want to see the slides, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks. That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.